We are here with Nathan Mirbold, and I'm so excited to be talking about this giant wedge between us, which is modernist bread. So, first of all, you know, you guys have done a lot of books, but you've never really done like a one subject-specific thing. Why is bread the first topic that modernist cuisine really wanted to delve into deep?
Well, bread is one of the oldest foods of humanity. It's one of our most important foods historically. Our ancestors, many of them, lived primarily on bread, main source of calories. Bread's also one of the most delicious foods.
Right, I was going to say, it's also great.
Yeah, it's totally great. And it's a very technological food in the sense that there's a lot going on, right? Bread is about harnessing yeast or other microorganisms, and so there's science and there's really interesting things involved in that.
One of the things that you guys do so well is whenever you're tackling something, you kind of start from scratch and say, well, let's take everything we know and sort of assume that maybe it's not true, and we're going to test everything. And one of kind of the most amazing things that you guys discovered is that, like, there's no standardization around bread. Like, even if you look at like a baguette, or you look at you know, a specific type of bread, a sourdough, you know, you looked at thousands and thousands of recipes and you found out that there's really no commonality. I mean, where did that research begin? And sort of talk me through that discovery.
You know, I thought it would be the other way.
Yeah.
So I thought that what we would find is that if you took, I think we've got 120 baguette recipes from key bread books all around the world. Okay, we will find that these cluster very tightly because to get a baguette, you need to do certain things very precisely, and that's what makes it a baguette, as opposed to maybe some other kind of bread that would cluster tightly some other place.
Yeah.
And I could not have been more wrong.
And why is that? Because we think of bread as being so science-based and so exacting, and what is the reason?
Well, there's two things. I think first, bread is more forgiving than we think.
Right.
Okay, so you can change the ingredients a lot. Another reason is that people have different technique.
Right.
And technique can compensate for some of the things. For example, if you put less yeast in the recipe, but you let it proof or ferment for longer, well, that can kind of compensate one for the other.
Right.
We also have very subjective ideas about what's the best bread.
Yes.
Both from, like, for example, on a baguette, what is the best baguette? And then you also have to say, well, okay, maybe it's slightly better to do that, but I'd rather change it to make it slightly easier to do, because best is not exactly, it's not only taste, it's not only texture, it's also the process of making it.
And the frequency with which you have to make it.
The thing that was crazy to me, though, is that almost every key ingredient in bread would vary by at least a factor of 2 between recipes, and sometimes as much as a factor of 4, which is just nuts.
Yes.
But
it's a huge
true.
variation. And does a lot of that have to do with history? Because you guys delve very deeply into the history of bread, which is long and across pretty much every culture. I mean, do you think that a lot of those variations just come from inventing bread in times where people didn't have access to the kind of information, obviously, that we have now?
That's certainly true in some ways. There are historical accidents or historical decisions that then biased all of the rest of history.
Right.
So my favorite example of that is the first breads were baked on hot rocks or on pans. They were flat breads. At some point, people decided to use ovens. Ovens had been developed to fire pottery, basically, or to fire bricks, so for a different purpose. Well, one set of folks said, I know, let's stick our bread to the ceiling. And that's what Indian naan is. Now, once you decided to use the ceiling, you were never going to have pizza.
Right.
Okay, just not going to happen.
Sorry. That was a big mistake.
Well, you're also not going to have pan breads. So that was an example of an early historical decision that biased a whole lot of thinking.
And do you find that tradition in some ways hampers that innovation? Because for hundreds of years people say, like, this is the way it's done, and then it's not necessarily even the correct way, or when you test it, it's, I mean, you bring up the topic of people putting raisins in to ferment. I mean, those types of things, people do them for years without any basis in reality.
It's very, people love a story. And not everyone checks to see if the story is true. Effectively, what science are the set of stories about the world that people have checked to see if they're true. And part of the thing in science is, oh, and you get to keep checking. And if you later discover, hey, this really doesn't work, well, or it doesn't work in this particular case, that's like important. So you definitely get a cultural bias where people start doing it a particular way, and then a story comes up and says, that's why we're doing it. Yeah. And it's not true. And the biggest example of that is kneading. Kneading is mostly a fraud. Kneading doesn't do what bread books and people have said for years that it does do. The story is, you must knead it in order to develop the gluten. And the no-knead recipes sort of put a lie to that, but we did lots of research to show even more definitively gluten development happens when flour gets wet.
Right.
Okay, that's like the key thing, is it getting wet. It's not how you stretch it and pull it and fold it. Those things have some effect on the final bread, but not that much.
Right, well maybe it was like the ancient way of just like getting out your anger. You know? So one of the claims that I found so interesting is getting rid of this notion that wheat bread is better for us than white bread, which I think is shocking. Talk to me about that, because, you know, we've been raised on this now for so long, and why is it untrue?
It's a funny thing that if you made a list of what everybody knows to be true about nutrition, one of those things would be that whole grain breads, whole wheat breads, for example, are A, more nutritious, and B, are better for you health-wise. And unfortunately, there's no evidence of either one. In fact, kind of the evidence to the contrary. On the nutrition side, the argument is, well, there's a lot of vitamins that are in this that aren't in the other. The answer is actually there's very few vitamins. A lot of the nutrients that people say are in bran, we don't actually absorb. Okay, the bran is fiber. It kind of leaves you pretty much the same state it came in. Okay, there's no polite way to say that, but you're not going to, human digestion doesn't break it down in the same way that a chemical analysis does. There's another effect, though, that's kind of worse, which is there are some chemicals that are in the bran part of bread, or of whole wheat, I should say. There's these chemicals called phytates, and they bind to minerals that you're trying to absorb. So having bound them, you don't absorb them. So for example, whole grain bread or bran blocks your ability to absorb iron. So if you run a little anemic and you might be taking iron supplements, you're trying to eat food to make your iron higher, and you're eating whole wheat bread, not a good idea.
And for people who kind of don't even understand the basics of like what is whole wheat and, you know, whole grain bread versus like what is the difference in the flour, like for people who just have been blindly going on like I'm eating whole wheat bread, like explain how that's different.
So the wheat kernel, this is little kernel, the outside of it is called the bran. The inside is called the endosperm. White flour is made by separating the bran out. And the way they separate the bran is basically they smash it with a hammer in a flour mill. And the bran on the outside is kind of leathery, so it doesn't break into as many pieces. So they smash it, and then they sift it. And then they keep doing that over and over again. And if you do that enough, you can make white flour, which is just the inside of that kernel. Whereas in a whole grain bread, they do the same separation. Then they grind the bran and they grind the insides, the endosperm, and they mix them back together in the same proportion that they originally were. And that puts little flecks of the brown bran. That's what you see in a whole grain flour. Those flecks are because you don't grind the bran as fine as you grind the rest of it. So the idea that that's better for you, unfortunately, is just wrong. If you looked on a nutrient by nutrient basis, there's a couple things that it would be slightly better on, but they're generally not important in the sense that they're not things most people run a deficit of.
And so where did that come from?
The really important ones, it actually is negative. It actually hurts you. You know, it came from a lot of well-meaning people extrapolating from early experiments.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing is bran is a source of fiber. And bran, and specifically whole grains, have been listed as something that will help you with colon cancer or heart disease. Only they've done a lot of big studies, and there's no effect.
One of the other things that's so great about this book is that there's so many recipes, and a lot of them are sort of classics that you've really delved into: bagels, pretzels, all different types of classic breads. What did you find most surprising as you were developing the recipes, and what are the ones you're most excited for people to try?
Well, in almost every place that we looked, we found cool stuff. I mean, for bagels, we found a way to make a great gluten-free bagel that actually has the texture of a bagel. You know, bagels are chewy, and that's tough to do with most gluten-free things. In the case of pretzels, we discovered that they work best if you dip them twice, not once. Once before baking and once after baking. In the case of rye breads, we found that there really isn't a lot of good rye flour in the United States, but we tell you what the best ones are and then how to re-mill the flour to make it finer to make better rye bread. Almost every place we looked, we found some cool trick that would work.
So you're just excited for people to get their hands on this tome now and start cooking.
I am.
Wonderful. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for being here. I'll see you over this giant thing. But if you want it, you know, modernist cuisine bread, it's amazing, and you guys always just come up with the coolest stuff. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you.